Hello everyone. In this video I would like to discuss Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, first published in 1621. Burton was born in 1577 in Leicestershire, died in 1640, so he lived into his 60s. One of the things to say about Burton's biography is that there's not much to it. He went up to Oxford in 1593, took his degree in 1602, and then essentially remained at Oxford for the rest of his life. He took holy orders and became a priest, and essentially was given 2 livings, so that he became, as it were, a kind of absentee priest who was able to hire subcontractors, for want of a better term, who would actually be the vicars or who would actually be the priests on hand to take care of the business of those churches, while Robert Burton would receive the tithes from those churches, so that was a good supplement to his income. And then he chose to remain at Oxford for the rest of his life because, as he tells us in the bit of self-disclosure that we get when he's talking about who he is, who is so importunate as to write this book and demand your time, that he is addicted to study. And he had at his disposal the great libraries of the individual colleges at Oxford, and then also the great library of the Bodleian. So he was able to immerse himself in essentially, he was an incredible polymath, essentially everything that had been written, as the Anatomy of Melancholy itself gives ample testimony of. That's about it. He stayed there for the rest of his life and spent his time first writing the Anatomy, as I say, first edition 1621, and then revising the Anatomy over the course of a number of editions during his life. What exactly is the Anatomy of Melancholy? By the way, he did write a few other things, plays and that sort of thing, but essentially he is known as the author of the Anatomy of Melancholy. It's his great contribution to letters. What exactly is the Anatomy of Melancholy? Well, first of all, it's a gigantic book, in the probably the handiest modern edition is the Everyman edition, 3 volumes. Runs to about 1,300 pages, 1,300 to 1,400 pages, so it's a big book. And I might give a disclaimer here, since you all have read maybe 20 pages of it, and I'll be confining my remarks primarily to the opening of the book. Anything I say in the course of an hour or so about a book that large is going to be in some way a distortion. On the other hand, the style is pretty continuous throughout, so much of what I say is applicable to the book as a whole, but just bear that in mind. We're talking about only a very minute portion of a large book. So first of all, it's a big book. It's big, roomy, bulky. It contains lots of different things. So it's the kind of book that not only did Burton work on over the course of many years, but it's the kind of book that one can dip into over the course of one's life. It's also a vastly learned book, as one can see even from the brief selections you all have read for today. Not only the Latin quotations, but the quotations from all different kinds of writers on all different kinds of subjects, whether it be military history or biography of the ancient world, the Renaissance, whether it be works having to do with medicine, religion, history, philosophy, literature generally. All of this is bound up in a way digested and then reconfigured and deployed to other means in Burton's gigantic magnum opus. And it should be a big book because it's a book about almost everything. For Burton, melancholy, which we might tend to think of as a particular distemper affecting particular people, for Burton it was essentially the universal disease that everyone suffered from. And so in writing about melancholy, Burton has a brief to write about essentially everything, about the entire human condition. And so it is, for that reason, it's a book about almost everything in the guise of being about melancholy, which in Burton's hands becomes a universal topic. I might say a word about the etymology of the title, The Anatomy of Melancholy. If you recall, the Renaissance theories of psychology going back to some degree to the ancient world, to the ancient Greeks. The idea is that we receive our temperament, we receive our character as a kind of distillation of four humors that exist in the body, humor being cognate with our word humid, these four fluids that are produced in the body, yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm, and that whichever of these predominates inside you tends to predominate. It tends to assure that your character will be more or less governed by that humor. So melancholy, the Greek etymology of that, melanos meaning black and cholia meaning bile, melancholy literally black bile. A melancholy person is one who has more black bile than he should relative to the other humors, and so he is marked or characterized by his temperament is characterized by having too much black bile, and that results, as we might think, given modern usage of the term, that results in a person who is perhaps sad, perhaps withdrawn, that kind of thing. But for Burton, it means a lot of other things besides just being sad and withdrawn. As I mentioned, he tends to think of it as the universal psychological malady. And Burton also subscribed to the basic physical ideas of this theory, that since these humors are all produced in the midsection of your body, roughly the abdomen, where the organs are that are responsible for producing these various humors, that the warmth of your body naturally, in a way, rather cooks or boils these humors so that the vapors of these humors then are released. And since vapor naturally rises, they rise from your abdomen into your brain, and that's how these things work. So Burton, being very much a man of his day in terms of being a humorist, rather like Ben Jonson, a person who subscribes to the Renaissance theory of the humors as determining our temperaments. So that much about melancholy then, black bile. Anatomy, the Greek word means a cutting, literally a cutting up, let's say. Tmao is the Greek verb to cut. That's for instance why an atom, which was considered the basic constituent of matter that couldn't be split, is called atom, cannot be cut. But at any rate, the anatomy of melancholy is a cutting up and down. To open a body and see what's inside it. So he's going to cut open this general idea of melancholy and analyze its constituent parts. So that's why he gives it the title that he does. And one might note that the title, by the way, is in an ancient learned language, the language which gives the language of the culture that gives us the beginnings of science, ancient Greek. And so that, in a way, the title sets the tone for the work. It's going to be at least claims to be a scientific treatise about a medical matter. The book has is contained in a tripartite structure. There are three main sections to this gigantic work. In the first, he talks about the causes of melancholy, and as melancholy itself is a manifold and complicated thing, there are lots of different causes of it. Studying too much can cause melancholy, that is, being too sedentary, taxing the brain too much. Being in love, especially if that love is unrequited, can cause it. Evil spirits can cause it, and so on. There can be supernatural, the hauntings of ghosts, and so there. And in this way, by the way, writing in the early 17th century, Burton shows himself again a man of his time in that, or if you recall, King James was very interested in the notion of supernatural effects on the human condition, having himself written a book entitled The Demonology, which proved an influence on Shakespeare's Macbeth, no doubt. So he writes about the causes of melancholy. Then, as one might expect, he goes into treatments of melancholy. And then, towards the end, he devotes time to special cases, special types of melancholy. And So as one would expect, a scientific treatise talking about a particular illness or malady talks about causes and then treatments. So that is pretty standard scientific organizational principle. One of the best things, one of the most important things, one of the most immediate qualities of the Anatomy of Melancholy is its style. We encounter it reading it sentence by sentence, and how those sentences are arranged then accounts for the style of the work. We have talked in the course of our discussion of various 17th century writers of two poetic styles in the 17th century, the metaphysical and the neoclassical. And we have talked about, when we were discussing Francis Bacon, we had talked about his prose style as being one of the two predominant prose styles of the 17th century. His is the paratactic or the Senecan style, where we get relatively short, simple, independent clauses piled up one on top of another, relatively easy to read. But Burton, his Anatomy of Melancholy, while he can give us that kind of paratactic style, also employs the other main style of prose writing, and that is the Ciceronian or periodic style, named for the ancient Roman orator Cicero. And this style is one that uses what we call subordination. It gives us a lot of dependent clauses, one piled up on top of another, and one doesn't often know what the sentence is finally going to say until one comes to the end of it, because the entire sentence is a structure of one idea that is not complete until another is a given, and then another, and then another, and finally you have to get to the end of the whole sentence for any portion of it to make complete sense. That's not true of Bacon's writing. Typically, one can read one clause of Bacon and understand that clause before moving to the next one. And we'll see examples of what I mean by the Ciceronian or periodic style. The Ciceronian, because Cicero, if one reads Cicero in Latin, for instance, if one looks at his speeches, one can easily encounter a sentence that goes on for a page, let's say 3/4 of a page is not uncommon in Cicero, where he heaps up dependent clause upon dependent clause upon dependent clause, and you don't understand what the whole thing means until you get to the main clause that's suspended until the end of the sentence. It's the kind of sentence that would say, although it is raining today and we had planned to go out for a picnic if the weather were good, nevertheless, because, and so on and so on. You see all of those dependent clauses. You don't know quite where that sentence is going until you get to the very end. We will make it up to you by taking you to the movies, that kind of thing. We don't understand where that sentence is going until we get to that final clause. So what you have in Burton, then, one of the hallmarks of his style is that he does employ this Ciceronian or subordinate style, periodic style, certainly more than Francis Bacon does, and that's for sure. He's not quite as, what should we say, concise in his sentence structure as is Francis Bacon. And along with the Ciceronian style is the fact that, and perhaps I should have put this as the first and more general hallmark of his prose style, and that is the fact that he does not shy away from long sentences. Burton can give us some extraordinarily long sentences. For example, to read one, this will be at the bottom of page 135, the bottom of the right-hand column. If one looks at just after the Latin quotation, I did sometime laugh and scoff with Lucian, and satirically tax with Menippus, lament with Heraclitus. Sometimes again I was petulantis plene cracino, and then again urure bilis iecur. I was much moved to see that abuse which I could not amend. That sentence is long enough, but here comes the next one. In which passion, howsoever I may sympathize with him or them, 'tis for no such respect I shroud myself under his name, but either in an unknown habit to assume a little more liberty and freedom of speech, or, if you will needs know, for that reason and only respect which Hippocrates relates at large in his epistle to Democritus, wherein he doth express how, coming to visit him one day, he found Democritus in his garden at Abdera, in the suburbs under a shady bower, with a book on his knee, busy at his study, sometimes writing, sometimes walking. Now, I haven't counted up the number of words in that sentence, but it's an enormously long sentence. And as I say, Burton doesn't shy away from using long sentences. And if one is going to write the subordinate, periodic, Ciceronian type of sentence, one is going to need long sentences. It's a relatively complicated sentence structure there, very different from the kind of prose you get in Francis Bacon or the King James translation of the Bible, one short independent clause and another independent clause and another independent, therefore another independent clause, and so on. And one of the hallmarks of these long sentences, and it's absolutely a hallmark of Burton, is his use of the catalog, his delight in heaping up example after example after example, and in this way giving us a feeling of what the ancient rhetoricians called copia, or fullness. And it's entirely appropriate for Burton because, in a way, I would say copia or fullness is the chief hallmark of the work itself. I mean, if you're talking about fullness of just range, we've got a book of 1,300 pages. If you're talking about fullness of its discussion of the human experience, you're talking about his discussion of a malady that he says affects everyone in every condition or state. So there is fullness in that treatment. If you're talking about his use of earlier authors, there's fullness there. There's fullness, and I mean the book is practically bursting with everything, whether it be allusion, whether it be example, whether it be ideas. It's that's primarily in some way the impression I get of this work is that it's however large it is, nevertheless, even at that size, it's still bursting at the seams, wanting to, everything is, he's cramming so much in that everything is threatening to spill out. There's that kind of vitality and vibrancy in Burton. And so an example perhaps of the kind of catalog that we see, we might try page 141, the bottom of the right, in your edition, the bottom of the right-hand column. Let's see. Yes, I'm sorry, bottom of the left-hand column. I'm, again, just after the Latin quotation, vox est praeterit nihil, etc. I am therefore in this point a professed disciple of Apollonius, a scholar of Socrates. I neglect phrases and labor wholly to inform my reader's understanding, not to please his ears. 'Tis not my study only, 'tis not my study and intent to expose it neatly, which an orator requires, but to express myself readily and plainly as it happens, so that as a river runs sometimes precipitate and swift, then dull and slow, now direct, then perambages, now deep, then shallow, now muddy, then clear, now broad, then narrow, doth my style flow, now serious, then light, now comical, then satirical, now more elaborate, then remiss, as the present subject required, or as at that time I was affected. So that delightful comparison between his style and the flowing of a river and the various ways in which a river can flow, quick and slow, direct or meandering, that kind of thing. So that gives you, and he's filled with this kind of catalog, as we will see again and again over the course of our discussion. Another example, perhaps one might see on, is it on page 152? Yes, if you look at it's a passage we might discuss again later. On the right-hand column of page 152, just again after the Latin quotation, ignoto caelum clangore remeguit. They care not what mischief they this is where he's talking about madness in warfare. They care not what mischief they procure, so that they may enrich themselves for the present. They will so long blow the coals of contention till all the world be consumed with fire. The siege of Troy lasted 10 years, 8 months. There died 870,000 Greeks, 670,000 Trojans at the taking of the city, and afterwards slain 276,000 men, women, women and children of all sorts. Caesar killed 1 million, Muhammad II, Turk, 300,000 persons. Sicinius Donatus fought in 100 battles, 8 times in single combat he overcame, had 40 wounds before, was rewarded with 140 crowns, triumphed 9 times for his good service. Marcus Sergius had 32 wounds, Scaeva the centurion, I know not how many, every nation hath their Hectors, Scipio, Caesars, and Alexanders. Our Edward IV was in 26 battles afoot, and as they do all, he glories in it, is related to his honor. At the siege of Jerusalem, 1.1 million died with sword and famine. At the battle of Cannae, 70,000 men were slain, as Polybius records, and as many at the battle Abbey with us. 'Tis no new, and so on and so on. One don't want to belabor that point, but there's a catalog of various battles, casualty lists, and so on, and he's just giving us far more examples than he needs to prove his point. There's a kind of reveling in the specific detail for its own sake, and the ability to marshal examples from the ancient world, from the medieval world, from the recent British history, and this kind of thing. Just the sheer delight in all of this, in all of human experience and its particularity and its applicability to questions of our own day. So there is that kind of, again, a delightful fullness, copia, and animation. We shouldn't say, by the way, that this means that he is not capable of giving us the short emphatic sentence, and in fact, given the general context of these long, complicated sentences, he's able to deploy the short emphatic sentence with a kind of even greater emphasis than Bacon sometimes can. If one looks at page 144, towards the bottom of the left-hand column in Witherspoon and Warnke, one sees that he's been going on and on about various topics. If you look at the very end of that paragraph, but I am over tedious, I proceed. So these very short independent clauses can gain a greater, gain a greater pithiness, gain a greater force because of the way in which they contrast with the sentences all around them. So he is certainly capable of writing paratactically when he needs to. And the last point I should make about his style, and it's perhaps the most obvious is one to anyone glancing at the page, even without reading in detail, and that is that his sentences are filled with Latin quotations, and this for a number of reasons. For one thing, it keeps this work in touch with the long Western European tradition. Since the ancient Roman Empire, Latin, and if you'll recall, the Roman Empire fell apart because of the invasion of these outsiders who came and settled, each speaking his own language or dialect, settled in various parts of Europe, so there was no universal language over Europe as there had been in the days of the Roman Empire. So that for the learned, and indeed those who were in the employ of the Catholic Church, which was the one institution that unified Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, Latin was the common language. And so by using Latin here, Burton is keeping in touch essentially with all the learning that had gone before him. So that's certainly one reason it's there. And by the way, I don't mean that this is necessarily a self-conscious decision on Burton's part. What that means is that as Burton is rooting around in the libraries at Oxford, many, if not most, of the learned works he's going to be reading will have been written in Latin. And so his mind just thinks in these terms. And so Latin then is fully integrated and incorporated in his own writing. In the same way that the old Latin Ciceronian prose style becomes integrated even in his English sentences. So it's also closely related to that idea, the notion, the fact that he uses Latin then, if it keeps him in touch with these authors that wrote sometimes as many as 1,600 years ago, but over the course of these 1,600 years, then it shows us that human nature doesn't really change. And what those writers said back then are applicable to us today. So that's another reason, perhaps, that one finds the use of Latin as a hallmark of Burton's style. It makes it a kind of timeless book. that if Burton can cite these authorities with approval from 1,000 years ago, then what he's writing about was valid 1,000 years before he writes it. It's valid in his day, and perhaps valid 1,000 years from his day. And then, of course, it's just sheer evidence of Burton's learning. It shows just how much he's read, and not just read, but read and absorbed. To be able to cite these writers in Latin, no doubt he must have kept commonplace books where he wrote down particular things. But there's no way that he could have kept a commonplace book of all of the quotations that appear over the course of the Anatomy of Melancholy. So so much of this was just part of his mental equipment that it's truly impressive. Well, that much then about the style. As I say, it's very difficult. I want to move now to the content of the anatomy, or at least the content of the selections that you have read. As I say, it's difficult to talk. The style that we've just been discussing is characteristic of the work as a whole across its 1,300 pages. What I'm going to talk now about content is going to necessarily distort the work as a whole, because it will be true of the portions you have read, though not true of the work in its entirety. In the selections that you have in the Green Tome, and it's a good selection, generally what we're focusing on is the beginning of the work, Democritus Jr. to the reader. And it begins with a discussion, around self-disclosure. In the early, Burton does not want to disclose himself, Robert Burton, as the writer of this treatise, so he adopts a pseudonym, Democritus Jr., and talks about why that's appropriate. Democritus was a certain kind of person. He's similar to Democritus in many ways, and therefore he is going to adopt that, assume that title. Now, Democritus was an ancient Greek philosopher who was particularly, and I might say here, I might pause at this moment and say that it's not really until modern times, until probably the late 18th and into the 19th century, that we begin to observe a sharp distinction between philosophy and science. And the reason for that is because scientific knowledge accumulates so rapidly after about 1600 that it's very difficult to view science as a branch of philosophy as it had been up until that time. But mind you that before the coming of Socrates, the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers were primarily what we would consider something like physicists. They were interested in the shape of the world. They were interested in how the world came to be. They were interested in the physical universe and how it was structured. It was Socrates that brought philosophy down from that speculation and brought it down, as it said, into the marketplace, because Socrates said that, look, without advanced scientific instruments and close observation, there's no way we can know how the universe began. There's no way we can know, how big the universe is and what stars consist of and this kind of thing. So we might as well talk about what we can come to understand, and that is how we treat one another in our life. But for that reason, science was very often traditionally called natural philosophy. That is, the branch of philosophy that dealt with nature. We think of Aristotle, for instance, primarily as a philosopher, and that wouldn't be inaccurate. But remember that Aristotle, in addition to writing books on metaphysics or writing books on the ethics, also wrote books about how animals reproduce. He also, perhaps, we're not sure if it's by him or if it's spurious, but certainly his name was attached to it, wrote a book on the heavens, that is the structure of the heavens and the motion of the heavenly bodies and this kind of thing. He wrote a book called The Physics and so on. So there's a philosopher who's interested in natural philosophy, that is the philosophy or the understanding of nature and the way it operates. And so Democritus is one of these. He is both a philosopher and one who's particularly interested in natural philosophy. Well, the same thing is true of Burton, as it turns out. He is philosophical to the extent that he is there at Oxford and devotes his time to reading and understanding essentially all the great works that have been written to his time, and yet he is discussing these matters of scientific import, and so he's a natural philosopher in that sense. So that's one reason he would adopt the title of Democritus. There are others, as he says on page 134 in the left-hand column. Democritus, as he's described by Hippocrates and Laertius, was a little warish old man, very melancholy by nature, and Burton tells us elsewhere that he himself is melancholy by nature, very melancholy by nature, averse from company in his latter days, and much given to solitariness. So also Burton. Burton is given to solitariness and to study. He likes to sit in the library and read, and so also did his namesake and his inspiration, Democritus. And in fact, his reading is particularly wide-ranging, and his interests are essentially universal. As he goes on to say about himself, if one looks at the bottom of right-hand column on page 134 and on to page 135, he talks about how he has had a roving humor, and again, humor meaning a kind of disposition or temperament. This roving humor, though not with like success, I have ever had, just like Democritus was interested and poked his nose in lots of different things, I have ever had, and like a ranging spaniel that barks at every bird he sees, leaving his game, I have followed all, saving that which I should, and may justly complain, and truly, qui ubique est nusquam est, who is everywhere is nowhere, which Gesner did in modesty, that I have read many books, but to little purpose for want of method. I have confusedly tumbled over diverse authors in our libraries, with small profit for want of art, order, memory, or judgment. He goes on to say he never traveled by map or by chart, but just where his inclination took him. He's just a voracious reader of things as his fancy, as his interests arise, then he reads what he can on that topic, and so on. So he is also a generalist, we might say, like Democritus as well. As he says, he calls at one point that he calls Democritus omnifarium doctus, learned in all things. And while Burton is very modest, he doesn't boast about his learning by any means. Nevertheless, we can fairly say, having read Burton, that he also is omnifarium doctus. He is learned in all things. Certainly, he shows himself to be that. And another interesting point about Burton, and we find this particularly a bit later in the section, page 142 and 143. He gives reference to this on several occasions, and that is that he admits that he is, technically speaking, a priest, not a physician, and yet he's writing about medical matters. On page 142, just a little over halfway down the left-hand column, he tells us, the last and great exception to my writing this book is that I, being a divine, have meddled with physic, things having to do with the physician, right, having to do with the physical body. So how, as a priest, do I have the right to become a doctor, to write about medical things? In those days before Dr. Google, where all of us can look things up at our own, to our own peril, by the way, I might say, and think that we can diagnose ourselves and take care of ourselves because of what we've read for 5 or 10 minutes on the internet. Burton is raising this kind of objection preemptively. How can I pretend to write about a complex and wide-ranging medical topic like this if I'm a priest? And he raises the issue as well. Let's see, on page 143, about the top of the right-hand column, when he talks about being a priest. And his answer to this question at that point, top of the right-hand column on page 143, is that a good priest will minister not only to his parishioners' souls, but also to their bodies. He says, a good divine either is or ought to be a good physician. a spiritual physician at least. And I'm reminded in this case of something George Herbert writes. You'll remember that George Herbert is primarily known for his poetry, his collection of poems called The Temple, but he also wrote a book called A Priest to the Temple, more colloquially known as The Country Parson. And that's a kind of handbook for what a good priest should be, particularly if he's serving a rural parish out in the middle of nowhere. And among other things, Herbert says in that book that he should know about herbs, and he should, in order to to provide basic physical care, should the need arise among his parishioners in a place perhaps far from any learned physicians. So there's a continuity there, oddly enough, with George Herbert. And so that's one of the topics at hand that he discusses early in his work, and that is this business sort of, what shall we say, self-referential question. Who is the writer, and what kind of person is the writer? And so he discloses a bit about himself, and partly by way of analogy with Democritus, and here and there says a word or two about having being at Oxford and having access to these great libraries and so on. Another, and this is probably the most important subject as a subject that you get in the selections that you had read for today, and that is the importance of melancholy as a topic. The first point to make about this is that he himself, Burton, claims that he himself is melancholy or has a tendency in that direction. You see this on page 136 when he anticipates the question, why in the world would I write such a book? He says that this is on the bottom of towards the bottom of the left-hand column, just after the paragraph begins, if any man except against the matter or manner of treating of this my subject, and will demand a reason of it, I can allege more than one. I write of melancholy by being busy to avoid melancholy. So we sometimes hear that people with a tendency toward depression might want to keep themselves busy, keep themselves distracted by engaging in hobbies or throwing themselves into their work. And so, I mean, how often have you heard that a person who's heartbroken by the loss of a loved one throws himself into his work as a kind of distraction? So he himself admits to having a predisposition toward melancholy, and so writing this gigantic work keeps him distracted from lapsing too deeply into it. So there is that. And then the second and far more important reason is that according to Burton's diagnosis, essentially everyone is melancholy. This is the universal theme. All of us suffer from this. And I will say here that, in this regard, that for Burton, melancholy comes to mean just more than sadness or a tendency toward depression. Melancholy can range from various kinds of obsessions, and who among us is not obsessed with something or other, to excessive worry. Who among us in these days and times is not worried about various things, to what can we say, to supernatural visions, excessive partiality to one thing or another. Essentially, just about anything that is the slightest deviation from an absolutely perfectly placid mental state, Burton is going to classify as a kind of melancholy, and therefore everyone essentially suffers from melancholy. He tells us this several times. If we look at page 144, for instance, if we look at the bottom of the left-hand column, just after the passage we looked at before, when he says, but I am over tedious, I proceed. I just absolutely love that line. One might say that, again, before one develops a taste for it, one might say that the book is a bit tedious, and the fact that he recognizes it is just delightfully good-natured of him. as he says at the beginning of the next paragraph, of the necessity and generality, right, how this is a sort of generally applicable topic, of the necessity and generality of this which I have said. If any man doubt, I shall desire him to make a brief survey of the world, as Cyprian advised Donatus, supposing himself to be transported to the top of some high mountain, and thence to behold the tumults and chances of this wavering world. He can't choose but either laugh or pity it. Saint Jerome, out of a strong imagination, being in the wilderness, conceived with himself that he then saw them dancing in Rome. And if thou shalt either conceive or climb to see, thou shalt soon perceive all the world is mad, that it is melancholy, that it dotes. Everyone in the world is mad. And then he gives us these panoramas of various human activities to show just how much madness and insanity affect us. And by the way, what would he say had he our cause that we do now? Just turn on the news, and I challenge you to dispute his claim that all the world is mad. Yeah, so if you look on the same page, about the middle of the right-hand column, let's see, as he says right in the middle of the right-hand column, for indeed who is not a fool, melancholy, mad, qui nil molitor inepte, who is not brain sick, right? Essentially, everyone is. A rhetorical question, which of course means that all of us are. And then towards the bottom of that column as well, he says, give me but a little leave, and you shall see by what testimonies, confessions, arguments I will evince it, that most men are mad. They have had as much need to go to a pilgrimage as did in our days they run to Compostela, Our Lady of Sikkim or Loreto, to seek for help. That is like to be a prosperous voyage as that of Guyana. There is much more need of hellebore than tobacco. Everyone is mad. It's a universal human experience no matter where you go. You will find insanity all around you. So that's a kind of apology for why he writes the book in the first place, why he devotes himself to this subject, because it's generally applicable. It's about all of human beings. You will find yourself described and discussed in various ways in this text. Yes, everyone is melancholy. What is his proof of this? Well, he begins by turning to the scriptures, as one would expect, both the Old Testaments initially, a long discussion of madness that you find in the Old Testament, and how many people in the Bible, and of course the Bible contains all sorts of, particularly in the Old Testament, all sorts of extreme behaviors of various peoples. On the left-hand column, on both columns of page 145, gives us lots of examples of what we might call madness, or if we're going to be extrajudicious, we might call sort of intense human experience from the Old Testament. And by the way, he carries on that way, page 147, by discussing examples of it from the New Testament. One example that I remember from years ago that he gave us, that he provides, is when towards the end of Acts, when I think it is when Paul is talking to Festus, the Roman governor, and is explaining why he does what he does, how he had become convinced that Jesus is God, and that he has devoted himself to missionary activity, that he is decried as mad on that occasion, and just all kinds of, and various people that Jesus cured of various types of insanity, the Gadarene demoniac, and so on. There are plenty of examples of that from Scripture. And then after Scripture, he goes on and gives lots of examples from different classical writers and from human experience generally. So his general survey begins around page 150 and goes on, as he says at the bottom of the left-hand column on page 150. That's what Democritus says of the world in his own time, right? Let's look at the, and then after the long quotation there, never so much cause of laughter as now, never so many fools and madmen. We would need lots of Democrituses to appropriately laugh at the world that we see around us now, and then he gives us lots of examples. So he begins by discussing on page 151 madness in religion. Towards the bottom of the column, left-hand column on page 151, if Democritus were alive now, and should but see the superstition of our age, our religious madness, as Mitterrand calls it, religiosum insaniam, so many professed Christians, yet so few imitators of Christ, so much talk of religion, so much science or knowledge, but so much science, but so little conscience. So that wonderful pun there on knowledge and conscience. So much knowledge, so many preachers, so little practice, such variety of sects, such have and hold of all sides. And I might remind you that though England was to some extent shielded from this, this was a continental war. I might remind you that he's writing in the time of the 30 Years' War. That was raging on the European mainland at this time, which is primarily a religious war fought between the Protestants and the Catholics in lots of different corners of Europe in lots of different ways. And so, well, he might talk about the kind of raving intensity of religious argument in his day. So he gives us the madness of religion there. And by the way, if you want, shall we say, catalogs, if you want some copia there, you certainly have it in abundance when he talks about madness in religion. Oh, that Peter and Paul were alive to see this. If he should observe a prince creep so devoutly to kiss his toe, and those red-capped cardinals, so poor parish priests of old, now princes, companions, what would he say? Caelum ipsum petitur stultitia. Had he met heaven itself, would see the foolishness. Had he met some of our devout pilgrims going barefoot to Jerusalem, Our Lady of Loretto, Rome, St. Iago, St. Thomas's shrine, to creep those counterfeit and maggot-eaten relics, had he been present at a mass and seen such kissing of paxes, crucifixes, cringes, duckings, and their several attires and ceremonies, pictures of saints, indulgences, this, I might say, is sort of typical Protestant attacks on Catholicism of the day. Vigils, fasting, feasts, crossing, knocking, kneeling, Ave Marias, bells, and many such jucundo rubi spectacula plebi, the sort of cheerful spectacles of the rude people, of the common people. Praying in gibberish and mumbling of beads, that he heard an old woman say her prayers in Latin, their sprinkling of holy water, and going on procession, in cedunt monachorum agmina mille quid memorum vexilla cruces so what a veritable army of thousands of kings advancing with their flags and their crosses, their idolatrous cults, and so on. The breviaries, bowls, hallowed beads, exorcisms, pictures, curious crosses, fables, and baubles. Had he read the Golden Legend, the Turks' Al-Quran, or the Jews' Talmud, the rabbins' comments, what would he have thought? How do you think that he might have been affected? He'd been more particularly examined a Jesuit's life among the rest. He should have seen a hypocrite profess poverty and yet possess more goods and lands than many princes, to have infinite treasures and revenues, and so on and so on. He goes. Again, one needn't flog that horse, that dead horse. But just wonderful copia there that goes on for quite some time when he's talking about madness in religion. One of my favorites, because of the sheer intensity of the imagery he gives us, is the madness in war. He does a fine job of summoning the kind of frenzied intensity that warfare can produce. As we see, one sees in World War I or World War II, for instance, the sort of modern use of technology to drum up this fervid support of one's own cause and anger and vitriol in respect of the cause of others. He gives us a sense of that kind of emotional intensity that attaches to war. On page 152, we'd already read some of this before, a few moments ago in the right-hand column of page 152, when he gives us all of the casualty statistics from a number of battles. By the way, I might point out that some of these battles are actual historical and some of these are legends, as the Trojan War, for instance. But just the beginning of that paragraph. What would Democritus have said to see, hear, read so many bloody battles, so many thousands slain at once, such streams of blood able to turn mills, unius obnoxiam furiosque, or to make sport for princes without any just cause, for vain titles, as St. Augustine says, precedency, some wench, or such like toy, or out of desire, domineering vainglory, malice, revenge, folly, madness, goodly causes all, obquas universus orbis bellicit caedibus misciatur, that the entire world is, shall we say, is a jumble of wars and destruction. While statesmen themselves, in the meantime, are secure at home, pampered with all delights and pleasures, take their ease, follow their faults, not considering what intolerable misery poor soldiers endure, their often wounds, hunger, thirst, etc. The lamentable cares, torments, calamities, and oppressions that accompany such proceedings, they feel not, take no notice of it. So wars are begun by the persuasion of a few debauched, harebrained, poor, dissolute, hungry captains, parasitical fawners, unquiet hotspurs, restless innovators, greenheads, to satisfy one man's private spleen, lust, ambition, avarice, etc. Tales rapiunt scelerata in praelia causae. So many crimes, evils are snatched in the cause of war. Flos hominum, the very flower of man, are destroyed, are mown down in battle. Proper men, well-proportioned, carefully brought up, able both in body and mind, sound, led like so many beasts to the slaughter in the flower of their years, pride and full of strength, without all remorse and pity, sacrificed to Pluto, that is the god of the underworld, that is killed. Killed up as so many sheep for devil's food, 40,000 at once. At once, said I? That would be good if it happened only once, but it happens all the time, everywhere, as you can read in any newspaper. And then he goes on talking about the kind of madness you see in people striving for status. How would this is on page 155, bottom of the left-hand column. How would our Democritus have been affected to see a wicked caitiff, or a fool, a very idiot, a fungus, a golden ass, a monster of men, to have many good men, wise men, learned men, attend upon him with all submission as an appendix to his riches, for that respect alone, because he hath more wealth and money, and to honor him with divine titles and bombast epithets, to smother him with fumes and eulogies, whom they know to be a dizzard, a fool, a covetous wretch, a beast, etc., because he is rich. Who among us have not experienced this? That simply because someone is rich, people fawn upon him and think the world of him. That even wise men, learned men, will flock around him and try to gain a little of his attention. In other words, how many rich people have an entourage full of sycophants? That's exactly the sort of thing he's talking about here. To see sub exuviis leonis onagarum, a filthy, loathsome carcass, a gorgon's head puffed by parasites, assume this unto himself, glorious. So a person who's often very worthless simply because he has money, people fawn all over him. Glorious titles in worth, an infant, a cuman ass, a painted sepulchre, an Egyptian temple. To see a withered face, diseased, deformed, cancered complexion, a rotten carcass, a viperous mind, an Epicurean soul, set out with pearls, jewels, diadems, perfumes, curious, elaborate works, as proud of his clothes as a child of his new coats, and a goodly person of angel-like divine countenance, a saint, a humble mind, a meek spirit, who is clothed in rags, beg, and now ready to be starved. So where's the sense in that? The homage that we pay to riches, no matter who possesses them, is another example of the general madness of human society. He goes on just after that paragraph to talk about insanity in the legal profession, to see many lawyers, advocates, so many tribunals, so little justice, so many magistrates, but so little care of the common good, so many laws, yet never more disorders, tribunal litigum segetum, a tribunal, a labyrinth, so many thousand suits in one court, sometimes so violently followed, to see injustitissimum saepe iuri praesidentum impium religioni impertissimum eruditioni ob otiosissimum labori monstrosum humanitati, to see a lamb executed, a wolf pronounced sentence, latro arraigned, and fur sit on the, that is a thief being dragged to the court, but a robber being dragged to the court, but a thief sitting on the bench to prosecute him, and so on and so on. It's even in the legal profession, or maybe, dare I say, especially in the legal profession, one finds this kind of madness and insanity, generally speaking, this kind of corruption. And it's worth pointing out here that in passages like these, you see Burton being satirical, and in fact that's entirely appropriate, because in his reading of the situation, Democritus was a satirist who laughs at the folly of the world, ridicules it, and so much of what Burton writes about in the Anatomy of Melancholy is worthy of satire, and so among other things, though I wouldn't call this primarily a satire, it does contain some marvelously satirical passages. I don't want to spend much time talking in detail about the section called The Love of Learning, but I would like to point out that for Burton, two of the most celebrated causes of melancholy is an over addiction to studying and to reading. Too much mental concentration is bad for the sort of general temperament, says Burton, and also love as well, particularly if your love is not requited. If it's a kind of tragic love, that also can be a source of melancholy. And in taking note of those two things, I want to point out something that one of the benefits of the Anatomy of Melancholy, and that is this. Shakespeare's greatest play, Hamlet, if we can be so bold as to make that judgment here, really revolves around the enigmatic character of Hamlet, and very largely revolves around the question of whether or not Hamlet is genuinely insane or whether he's pretending to be insane. So Hamlet, let's say very, very early first decade, 1600s, so 1601, 1602, sometime in there, 1603. But 1601, roughly speaking, let's say, that Hamlet, one of the great questions about him is what exactly makes him tick? Is he genuinely melancholy, or is he pretending to be melancholy? And we remember that Hamlet is a scholar, and we remember that Hamlet is rejected by Ophelia, who ultimately chooses her father over Hamlet. And so this book that is being written, roughly contemporary with, Hamlet is a bit earlier, but roughly contemporary with Hamlet, is a treasure trove of insight about about Shakespeare's great character, Hamlet. If one really wants to try to figure Hamlet out and figure out what Shakespeare might have meant by melancholy or insanity, and how legitimate these are as causes of melancholy or insanity, one can certainly do worse than look at Burton. Certainly one should look at Burton if one wants an understanding of 17th century literature, and if one wants just a magnificent work to dip into over the course of one's life. I remember that in his autobiography or his memoir, Surprised by Joy, C.S. Lewis mentions the Anatomy of Melancholy as one of his favorite books to take to breakfast. When you're having a meal and no one else is around and you're by yourself, take a copy of the Anatomy of Melancholy. And Lewis was one who, if memory serves, says it's not a book to be read through from page 1 to page 1300, seriatim, but is a book to be dipped into. You dip into it here and there, carry it around with you as a kind of companion, a vade mecum, as it were. And so it is, just a wonderful, magnificent book, full of all of human life and experience, and full of all of the energy that portends. It really is a strange and interesting book, and one of the great prose classics of the 17th century.